My husband David thought he'd played the perfect game when he served me those divorce papers. His signature bold and confident across the bottom of documents that he believed would leave me with practically nothing. The prenup we'd signed 7 years ago was supposed to be his insurance policy, his golden parachute that would protect his real estate empire if our marriage ever crumbled. What David didn't realize, what his expensive attorneys had somehow missed, was that I'd spent months crafting every single clause in that prenup with surgical precision. Article 13, buried deep in the legal jargon on page 47, was about to become his worst nightmare and my greatest victory. The text message arrived at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing merger documents in my downtown Austin office. David's words glowed on my phone screen with smug satisfaction. "Hope you enjoyed the lifestyle while it lasted, Sarah. Should have been more careful about who you married. My lawyers say you'll be lucky to get spousal support for 2 years. Article 13 is going to be very educational for you." I couldn't help but smile as I set the phone down on my mahogany desk, the irony of his message almost too perfect to be real. If only he knew that Article 13 wasn't his protection, it was his destruction, and I'd been waiting 7 years for him to trigger it. The prenuptial agreement David thought would save him actually contained a clause so devastating that when activated, it would transfer not just half of his assets to me, but everything he'd accumulated during our marriage, plus accumulated interest calculated at prime rate plus 3%, compounded annually. The triggering event was specifically defined as material breach of marital fidelity, with documented evidence of extramarital relationship lasting more than 6 months. What made it even more beautiful was the liquidated damages provision I'd carefully embedded within the dense legal language, specifying that the injured party would receive additional compensation equal to 150% of the marital estate's appreciation since the contract's execution. David's affair with Jessica Chen had been going on for 8 months, and I had documented every hotel receipt, every intimate dinner, every weekend getaway they thought they'd kept secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 7 years ago, David Mitchell appeared to be everything I thought I wanted in a partner. We met at a real estate investment conference in downtown Austin, where I was representing a corporate client interested in acquiring commercial properties throughout Texas. David commanded the room during his presentation about sustainable development in the Hill Country, his confidence magnetic as he outlined his vision for eco-friendly luxury communities that would reshape Austin's suburban landscape. He was handsome in that polished way that spoke of expensive grooming and careful attention to image, his dark hair perfectly styled, his custom suit fitting like it had been crafted specifically for his athletic frame. When he approached me after his presentation, champagne flute in hand, and that devastatingly charming smile, I felt the immediate pull of attraction mixed with professional respect. "Sarah Rodriguez, right?" he said, extending his hand with practiced ease. "I couldn't help but notice your questions during the Q&A session. Your understanding of zoning regulations and environmental impact assessments is impressive. Most lawyers I meet barely understand the basics of commercial development." The compliment was perfectly calibrated, acknowledging my expertise while subtly establishing his own superior knowledge of the field. I should have recognized it then as the first move in a carefully orchestrated game. But I was 28, successful, and perhaps a little lonely after years of focusing entirely on building my career at Rodriguez & Associates. Our courtship unfolded with the kind of intensity that makes rational people make irrational decisions. David pursued me with strategic precision, planning elaborate dates that showcased both his wealth and his thoughtfulness. Weekend trips to his Lake Travis house, where we'd spend hours discussing business strategies while watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. Private dinners at Austin's most exclusive restaurants, where he'd already spoken to the sommelier about wine pairings that complemented my preferences. Cultural events at the Austin City Limits Music Festival and South by Southwest, where his connections provided VIP access and backstage introductions to artists I'd mentioned enjoying. The proposal came exactly 18 months later, during a charity gala for the Austin Children's Museum, where we'd both served on the planning committee. David had arranged for the evening's entertainment to include a surprise performance by a local string quartet that played our favorite song, while he dropped to one knee in front of 300 of Austin's most influential residents. The ring was stunning, a 3-carat diamond surrounded by emeralds that caught the light from the venue's crystal chandeliers. The applause was thunderous, the photographs perfect, and I felt like I was living in a fairy tale that had been orchestrated with Hollywood precision. The engagement period revealed aspects of David's personality that I initially interpreted as protective rather than controlling. He had strong opinions about our wedding plans, insisting on a venue that would properly showcase our union to the business community. The guest list became a strategic networking opportunity, with seating charts designed to facilitate profitable conversations between potential business partners. Our honeymoon destination was chosen partly for its romantic appeal, but also because David had identified investment opportunities in Costa Rica that he wanted to explore while we were there. Most significantly, David insisted on a prenuptial agreement, presenting it as a standard precaution that any successful couple should take. "It's not that I don't trust you," he explained one evening as we reviewed the initial draft his attorney had prepared. "It's about protecting what we've both worked so hard to build. If something ever happened to our marriage, which it won't, this ensures that we both walk away with what we brought to the relationship." The document was intimidating in its complexity. 47 pages of dense legal language that covered everything from asset division to spousal support limitations. What David didn't know was that I had spent my law school years specializing in contract law, with a particular focus on prenuptial agreements and their enforceability. I'd written my law review article on the evolution of marital contracts, and had clerked for a judge who'd presided over some of the most contentious divorce cases in Texas history. When I reviewed David's proposed prenup, I immediately recognized it as a heavily one-sided document designed to protect his assets while leaving me vulnerable in the event of divorce. The terms were so skewed in his favor that I wondered if he truly understood what he was asking me to sign. Instead of confronting him directly about the unfairness of his proposal, I decided to take a different approach. I told David that I wanted to have my own attorney review the document, which was standard practice, and couldn't be refused without raising suspicions. What I didn't tell him was that I intended to completely rewrite the agreement, crafting language that would appear to give him the protection he wanted, while actually creating a legal trap that would spring shut if he ever betrayed our marriage vows. Working with Patricia Rodriguez, my mentor and the senior partner at our firm, I spent 3 months crafting what would become David's downfall. Pat had been practicing family law for over 30 years, and had seen every trick, every loophole, every clever clause that spouses had used to protect or attack each other's assets. She understood immediately what I was trying to accomplish, and helped me create language that was both legally bulletproof and practically invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. The key was Article 13, which appeared in the middle of a section dealing with asset appreciation and investment income. To casual readers, including David and his attorney, it seemed like a standard clause defining how increases in property value would be calculated and divided. The language was deliberately dry and technical, buried among discussions of appraisal methodologies and market rate calculations. But within that seemingly innocuous text was a provision that would transfer complete ownership of all marital assets to the non-breaching party in the event of material breach of marital fidelity. The definition of material breach was carefully crafted to be both specific and comprehensive. It required documented evidence of extramarital relationship lasting more than 6 months, which would eliminate the possibility of David claiming that a brief indiscretion should be forgiven. The documentation requirements were stringent but not impossible to meet, requiring either photographic evidence, written communications, or witness testimony that could establish the timeline and intimate nature of the relationship. Most importantly, the clause included a liquidated damages provision that would add 150% of the marital estate's appreciation since the contract's execution, plus interest calculated at prime rate plus 3%, compounded annually. This meant that if David triggered the clause, he wouldn't just lose half of his assets, he would lose everything, plus additional compensation that would grow larger with each passing year. The longer our marriage lasted, the more devastating the consequences would become. The genius of the clause was in its presentation. David's attorney reviewed the document multiple times, focusing on the provisions that seemed most relevant to his client's concerns. The asset protection measures, the spousal support limitations, the business interest protections, all of these were clearly defined and heavily weighted in David's favor. Article 13 was positioned as a mutual protection clause, applying equally to both parties, and appearing to simply define the consequences of marital misconduct in general terms. When we met to review the final version of the prenup, David was completely satisfied with its terms. His attorney had advised him that the document provided excellent protection for his real estate development business and his personal assets, while limiting his exposure to spousal support obligations. The language was complex but seemed to clearly favor his interests, and he signed it without hesitation, confident that he had secured his financial future regardless of what happened to our marriage. The wedding was everything David had envisioned, a spectacular celebration at the Four Seasons Austin, with 400 guests, including the mayor, several city council members, and most of Austin's real estate development community. The ceremony was held on the hotel's terrace overlooking Lady Bird Lake, with the downtown skyline providing a stunning backdrop for our vows. David looked magnificent in his custom tuxedo, his smile radiant as he promised to love and cherish me for better or worse, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others until death do us part. As I spoke my own vows, looking into his eyes and seeing what I believed was genuine love and commitment, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me hoped that the prenup would never be relevant, that we would build a life together based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. But another part of me, the part trained in legal strategy and risk management, felt satisfied knowing that I had protected myself from the possibility of betrayal. If David ever decided to abandon our marriage for another woman, he would discover that his insurance policy had actually been his death warrant. The early years of our marriage were genuinely happy, or at least I believed they were at the time. David's real estate development company, Mitchell and Anderson Development, was thriving in Austin's booming market, with projects ranging from luxury condominiums in the downtown core to sprawling suburban developments in the hill country. My own career was advancing rapidly at Rodriguez & Associates, where I had made partner 3 years after our wedding and was building a reputation as one of Austin's most skilled corporate attorneys. We settled into a lifestyle that seemed to perfectly balance professional success with personal fulfillment. Our home in Westlake Hills was a stunning example of modern architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased views of the surrounding hills and a pool area that became the setting for elaborate dinner parties. We traveled frequently, sometimes for business but often for pleasure, exploring wine regions in California and Europe, attending music festivals and cultural events that kept us connected to Austin's vibrant art scene. David was an attentive husband during those early years, remembering important dates and celebrating my professional achievements with genuine enthusiasm. When I won a particularly complex litigation case that had dragged on for 18 months, he surprised me with a weekend trip to New Orleans, where we stayed at the Windsor Court Hotel and spent our days exploring the French Quarter and our evenings enjoying some of the city's legendary restaurants. When I was invited to speak at a national conference about corporate law innovations, he rearranged his schedule to accompany me, playing the role of supportive spouse with apparent sincerity. But looking back now, I can see the subtle signs that David's commitment to our marriage was never as absolute as his wedding vows had suggested. His work schedule became increasingly demanding, with late nights at the office and weekend site visits that seemed to multiply as his company grew. His phone conversations became more private, with calls taken in his home office behind closed doors or during walks around our neighborhood. Most tellingly, his interest in my work began to wane, shifting from genuine curiosity about my cases to polite but distracted responses when I tried to share significant developments. The first concrete indication that something was wrong came during our 5th year of marriage, when I noticed changes in David's behavior that couldn't be explained by work stress alone. He began paying more attention to his appearance, spending longer periods at the gym, and updating his wardrobe with more fashionable clothes. His phone was always face down on tables, and he'd developed a habit of checking messages constantly, even during our private dinners at home. When I commented on these changes, he attributed them to the pressures of managing a growing business and the need to maintain a professional image in Austin's competitive real estate market. The turning point came 6 months ago, when David hired Jessica Chen as Mitchell & Anderson's new marketing coordinator. Jessica was 26, recently graduated from the University of Texas with a degree in communications, and possessed the kind of effortless beauty that made people stop and stare. She had long black hair that she wore in loose waves, striking brown eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. More importantly, she had the kind of enthusiastic energy that made her seem perpetually excited about whatever project she was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story I was discussing. David introduced Jessica to me at a company barbecue held at our Lake Travis house, describing her as a brilliant addition to their marketing team who would help take Mitchell and Anderson to the next level. I watched them interact throughout the afternoon, noting the way David's attention seemed to focus on her whenever she spoke, the way his laughter came more easily when she made jokes, the way he found excuses to include her in conversations with potential clients and business partners. Initially, I attributed my concerns to normal marital jealousy, the kind of minor insecurity that any spouse might feel when their partner hired an attractive young employee. David had always been a naturally charismatic person who connected easily with people, and his success in real estate development depended partly on his ability to charm clients and colleagues. It would be unreasonable to expect him to avoid all interaction with attractive women in his professional life. But as the weeks passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. David began working even later hours, often not returning home until after 10 o'clock on weeknights. His explanations became increasingly vague, referencing client meetings and project deadlines that seemed to require his personal attention at unusual hours. When I suggested joining him for some of these business dinners, he explained that they were working sessions rather than social events, and that my presence might make clients uncomfortable about discussing sensitive financial matters. The breakthrough came when I decided to surprise David with dinner at his office, something I'd done occasionally throughout our marriage, when he was working particularly long hours. I arrived at Mitchell and Anderson's offices at 7:30 on a Thursday evening, expecting to find him reviewing contracts or preparing presentations. Instead, I found the main office empty except for the cleaning crew, who told me that everyone had left hours earlier. David's car wasn't in the parking garage, and when I called his cell phone, it went directly to voicemail. When David finally came home at nearly midnight, I confronted him about the discrepancy between his stated location and the reality I discovered. His explanation was flustered and unconvincing, involving a last-minute change of plans and a client meeting that had moved to a restaurant across town. He seemed genuinely surprised by my unexpected visit to his office, and I could see him mentally calculating how to explain the inconsistency without admitting whatever he'd actually been doing. That night, lying in bed beside my husband while he slept, I made the decision that would ultimately trigger Article 13 of our prenuptial agreement. I would hire a private investigator to document David's activities, not because I wanted to catch him in an affair, but because I needed to know the truth about what was happening to our marriage. If David was simply working late and I was being paranoid, the investigation would provide reassurance and allow us to address whatever communication problems had developed between us. If he was having an affair, I would have the documented evidence necessary to activate the most devastating clause in legal history. The next morning, I contacted Marcus Thompson, a former FBI agent who transitioned into private investigation work after retiring from federal service. Marcus had testified as an expert witness in several of my corporate litigation cases, and I knew him to be both skilled and discreet. When I explained what I needed, he understood immediately that this wasn't about gathering ammunition for a bitter divorce battle, but about establishing facts that would determine the legal framework under which our marriage would end. Marcus began his surveillance of David the following week, using techniques he'd perfected during his years investigating white-collar crime for the federal government. Within 72 hours, he'd documented David's pattern of deception with photographic evidence and detailed timelines that would satisfy any court's requirements for proof of adultery. The affair with Jessica Chen was far more extensive than I'd imagined, involving not just occasional dinner dates but regular overnight stays at her apartment in the Domain, weekend trips to San Antonio and Houston, and intimate dinners at Austin's most romantic restaurants. The documentation was heartbreaking in its thoroughness. Photographs of David and Jessica entering her apartment building at sunset and leaving together the next morning. Credit card receipts from lingerie stores and jewelry boutiques where David had purchased gifts that had never appeared in our home. hotel reservations for romantic getaways to Fredericksburg and San Antonio, where they'd stayed in luxury suites while David told me he was visiting construction sites or meeting with potential investors. Most damning was a series of text messages that Marcus had obtained through legal but sophisticated surveillance techniques. David's communications with Jessica revealed not just physical intimacy, but emotional involvement that clearly indicated a serious relationship rather than a casual fling. He wrote about his feelings for her, his excitement about their future together, and his plans to end our marriage once he'd positioned his assets to minimize financial damage. The messages showed that the affair had been ongoing for more than 8 months, well beyond the 6-month threshold specified in Article 13. As I reviewed Marcus's reports in my downtown office, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that surprised me with their intensity. The betrayal was devastating, not just because of the affair itself, but because of the calculated nature of David's deception. He hadn't simply fallen in love with another woman. He had systematically planned the destruction of our marriage while maintaining the facade of a devoted husband. The financial planning he'd referenced in his messages to Jessica made it clear that he viewed our divorce as a business transaction, with my emotional and financial well-being as acceptable casualties in his pursuit of a new life. But alongside the pain and anger was a sense of vindication that felt almost intoxicating. 7 years ago, when I'd crafted Article 13 and embedded it in our prenuptial agreement, I'd hoped never to use it. But I'd also understood that marriage was a contract like any other, and that contracts required enforcement mechanisms to ensure that both parties honored their obligations. David's betrayal had triggered the most comprehensive asset forfeiture clause in the history of Texas family law, and he had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him. The math was staggering. When we'd married 7 years ago, David's net worth had been approximately $12 million, primarily tied up in his real estate development company and various investment properties. During our marriage, his wealth had grown to nearly $45 million, thanks to Austin's booming real estate market and several particularly successful development projects. Under normal divorce circumstances, even without a prenup, I would have been entitled to half of the assets accumulated during our marriage, roughly $16 million. But Article 13 changed everything. The clause specified that material breach of marital fidelity would result in complete forfeiture of all marital assets to the non-breaching party, plus liquidated damages equal to 150% of the marital estate's appreciation since the contract's execution. This meant that David would lose not just his share of our accumulated wealth, but everything, plus an additional penalty that would bring my total settlement to nearly $70 million. The interest provision made the numbers even more devastating. Prime rate plus 3%, compounded annually for 7 years, had resulted in an additional $12 million in accumulated interest that would be added to the base settlement. By the time all calculations were complete, David's affair with Jessica Chen would cost him approximately $82 million, leaving him with nothing but the personal assets he'd owned prior to our marriage and whatever remained of his business equity that hadn't been commingled with marital property. As I sat in my office that afternoon, reviewing the legal documents that would soon destroy my husband's life, I felt a sense of poetic justice that was both satisfying and slightly terrifying. David had entered our marriage believing that his prenuptial agreement would protect him from the financial consequences of his eventual betrayal. Instead, he'd signed his own financial death warrant, creating a legal mechanism that would transfer his entire fortune to me the moment he chose to break his marriage vows. The irony was almost too perfect to be accidental. David's confidence in his own cleverness, his assumption that he could manipulate legal documents to serve his interests, had blinded him to the possibility that he might be outmaneuvered by someone with superior legal skills and deeper strategic thinking. His arrogance had created the very vulnerability that would ultimately destroy him, and he'd done it all with a smile on his face and a pen in his hand. Tomorrow I would begin the process of serving David with divorce papers that would activate Article 13 and transfer his entire fortune to me. Tonight, I would go home to our beautiful house in Westlake Hills, where my husband would likely be waiting with another lie about his late night at the office, completely unaware that his world was about to end. The morning I decided to execute Article 13, I woke before dawn and drove to my secret penthouse in downtown Austin, the one David knew nothing about. I'd purchased the property 3 years into our marriage, using proceeds from a personal injury case settlement that had never been disclosed in our joint financial statements. The condo occupied the entire 42nd floor of the newest luxury tower on Rainey Street, with panoramic views of Lady Bird Lake and the hill country beyond. This was where I came when I needed to think clearly, away from the beautiful prison of our Westlake Hills home where every room held memories of our life together. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sunrise paint the Austin skyline in shades of amber and gold, while reviewing the final documentation that Marcus had delivered the night before. The photographs were damning in their clarity and detail. David and Jessica leaving her apartment building at dawn, his arm around her waist in a gesture of intimate familiarity. The two of them sharing a kiss in the parking garage of the Four Seasons, where they'd spent a long weekend while David told me he was attending a development conference in Houston. Credit card statements showing purchases at Victoria's Secret and Tiffany & Company. Gifts that had clearly been intended for someone other than his wife. Most devastating were the text message transcripts that Marcus had obtained through his surveillance network. David's communications with Jessica revealed a level of emotional intimacy that went far beyond physical attraction. He wrote about his frustration with our marriage, describing me as cold and calculating, and complaining that I was more interested in my legal career than in supporting his business ambitions. He promised Jessica that he would leave me as soon as he could, quote, arrange things financially, explaining that he needed to protect his assets from what he assumed would be a vindictive divorce proceeding. One message in particular had seared itself into my memory. David had written to Jessica after one of our dinner parties, describing how he'd watched me networking with potential clients and felt disgusted by what he called my shameless ambition. He told her that he'd married me because he thought a successful attorney would be an asset to his career, but that he'd realized I was too independent and strong-willed to be the kind of supportive wife he actually wanted. The casual cruelty of his assessment was breathtaking, reducing our 7-year marriage to a business transaction that had failed to deliver expected returns. But the messages also revealed David's fundamental misconception about our prenuptial agreement and his legal vulnerability. In one particularly revealing exchange, he'd assured Jessica that the prenup would protect most of his assets, limiting my claim to a modest settlement that would allow them to start their new life together without significant financial hardship. He'd boasted about the clever language his attorney had crafted, describing clauses that would shield his business interests and real estate holdings from division in divorce proceedings. Reading those messages, I'd felt a surge of anticipation that was almost predatory in its intensity. David's confidence in his prenuptial protection was about to collide with the reality of Article 13, and the impact would destroy everything he'd built during our marriage. His attorney's clever language had been no match for my own legal expertise, and his assumption that I would accept a modest settlement revealed how completely he'd underestimated both my capabilities and my preparation. The formal activation of Article 13 required precise legal choreography that I'd been planning for months. My first call was to James Sullivan, the family law specialist I'd retained to handle the divorce proceedings. James was widely regarded as Austin's most aggressive divorce attorney, with a reputation for creative legal strategies and ruthless execution. When I'd first approached him 6 months earlier, ostensibly for general consultation about prenuptial agreements, he'd been intrigued by the unusual clause structure I'd described. Now reviewing Marcus's documentation and the specific language of Article 13, his excitement was palpable. "Sarah, this is the most comprehensive asset forfeiture provision I've ever seen in a prenuptial agreement," he said, spreading the documents across his conference table like a general reviewing battle plans. "The triggering conditions have been met beyond any possible legal challenge. The documentation establishes a clear pattern of adultery lasting more than 8 months, well beyond the 6-month threshold specified in the clause. The liquidated damages calculation is mathematically precise and legally bulletproof." David's attorney is going to have a very bad day when he realizes what his client actually signed. The filing strategy was designed to maximize psychological impact while ensuring complete legal compliance. Rather than simply serving David with standard divorce papers, we would present him with a comprehensive legal package that included not only the petition for dissolution of marriage, but also a detailed accounting of the Article 13 activation and its financial consequences. The documents would make it immediately clear that this wasn't a negotiation but an execution of predetermined contract terms. Most importantly, we would simultaneously file for temporary restraining orders that would freeze all of David's business and personal accounts, preventing him from transferring assets or liquidating holdings once he realized the scope of his financial exposure. The freezing orders were justified by the prenuptial agreement's anti-dissipation clauses, which I'd specifically included to prevent either party from hiding assets upon discovery of marital misconduct. The psychological warfare began before David even received the papers. James arranged for service to occur at Mitchell and Anderson's offices during their weekly staff meeting, ensuring that David would be surrounded by employees and business partners when he received the most devastating news of his life. The process server would arrive with a leather portfolio containing not just the divorce petition, but also copies of the photographic evidence documenting his affair, creating maximum humiliation in front of the professional colleagues whose respect he valued most. Meanwhile, I would be safely positioned in James's conference room, monitoring David's reaction through surveillance equipment that Marcus had positioned throughout the Mitchell and Anderson offices. We would watch in real time as David's world collapsed, documenting his responses for potential use in later proceedings if he attempted to claim that the prenuptial agreement had been signed under duress or without full understanding of its terms. The morning of execution arrived with crystalline clarity that seemed almost symbolic. Austin's notorious humidity had lifted overnight, leaving behind one of those perfect hill country days when the sky appears infinitely blue and the air carries hints of cedar and wildflowers from the surrounding countryside. I dressed carefully in a charcoal gray suit that conveyed professional authority without appearing celebratory, understanding that the day's events would likely be photographed and analyzed by local media once word of the massive settlement began to circulate. At exactly 10:30 a.m., while David was presenting quarterly development projections to his staff and business partners, the process server entered Mitchell and Anderson's conference room. Marcus's surveillance feed provided perfect audio and visual coverage of the moment when David's comfortable world began to disintegrate. I watched from James's office as my husband accepted the leather portfolio with casual confidence, assuming it contained routine legal documents related to one of his development projects. The transformation was almost instantaneous. David's expression shifted from mild curiosity to confusion to dawning horror as he scanned the divorce petition and realized what he was reading. His face drained of color so rapidly that I worried he might actually faint in front of his assembled colleagues. His hands began to shake as he turned to the photographic evidence, seeing himself captured in intimate moments with Jessica that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. But the true devastation came when David reached the financial calculations, showing the Article 13 activation and its consequences. I watched him read the numbers once, then again, his lips moving silently as he tried to process the mathematical reality of his situation. $82 million. Everything he'd built during our marriage, plus liquidated damages, plus accumulated interest, all transferred to me as penalty for his marital infidelity. The room fell completely silent as David's business partners and employees realized that something catastrophic was unfolding before their eyes. Robert Anderson, David's co-founder and closest friend, reached for the documents with obvious concern, but David clutched them against his chest with desperate possessiveness, as if hiding the papers could somehow make their contents untrue. "I need to make a phone call," David said finally, his voice hoarse with shock. He stood on unsteady legs and walked toward his private office, still clutching the legal documents that had just destroyed his life. Through the surveillance feed, I could see his hands trembling as he dialed his attorney's number, probably hoping that Bill Hayes could somehow explain away the financial apocalypse that had just been visited upon him. The conversation with his attorney was brief and brutal. Even through the surveillance audio, I could hear Bill Hayes' voice rising in panic as he realized the scope of the legal disaster his client was facing. There would be no clever arguments or procedural challenges that could undo the damage. David had signed the prenuptial agreement voluntarily, with full legal representation, after extensive review and negotiation. The terms were clear, the triggering conditions had been met, and the financial consequences were mathematically precise. Within an hour, David's business accounts were frozen by court order, his personal credit cards had been canceled, and his access to the company's operating funds had been suspended, pending resolution of the asset division. The speed of the financial lockdown was breathtaking, a testament to the preparation that had gone into designing Article 13's enforcement mechanisms. David had gone from multimillionaire real estate developer to effectively indigent in the span of a single morning. The news of the massive prenuptial settlement spread through Austin's business community with the velocity of wildfire. By afternoon, local television stations were running segments about the prenup from hell that had transferred an estimated $82 million from a cheating husband to his brilliant attorney wife. The story had everything that made for compelling local news: wealth, betrayal, legal maneuvering, and a David versus Goliath narrative where the underestimated spouse had emerged victorious. Most satisfying was the reaction from Jessica Chen, who learned about David's financial destruction through the same news reports as everyone else. Marcus's surveillance showed her frantically calling David's cell phone, which had been disconnected when his service plan was automatically canceled due to the frozen accounts. The young woman who had planned to build a life with Austin's successful real estate developer suddenly found herself involved with a man who couldn't afford to pay his phone bill. The social consequences were equally swift and merciless. Austin's elite social circles, which had embraced David and Jessica's relationship with knowing winks and conspiratorial silence, immediately began distancing themselves from the couple once the financial scandal became public. Invitations to charity galas and networking events dried up overnight, as hosts realized that David's reduced circumstances made him liability rather than asset to their social gatherings. That evening, I returned to our Westlake Hills home for the final time, arriving to find David's BMW in the driveway, despite the fact that the vehicle was now technically my property under the terms of the asset transfer. I entered through the front door using my key, stepping into the marble foyer where we'd posed for countless photographs during our years as Austin's power couple. David was waiting in the living room, still wearing the same clothes he'd worn to the office that morning, though they now appeared rumpled and disheveled. His usually perfect hair was messed from running his hands through it, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and shock. On the coffee table in front of him were scattered the legal documents that had destroyed his life, along with several empty whiskey glasses that testified to his afternoon's attempts at self-medication. "You planned this," he said when he saw me, his voice a mixture of accusation and disbelief. "The whole time we were married, you were planning this." I set my purse on the entry table and walked calmly into the living room, noting how small and defeated he appeared in the chair that had once seemed like a throne from which he ruled his domestic kingdom. "I planned for the possibility of this," I corrected gently. "I hoped it would never be necessary." David laughed bitterly, a sound without humor or warmth. "Article 13, your little insurance policy. How long did it take you to craft that masterpiece?" 3 months, I replied honestly, working with Patricia Rodriguez to ensure that every word was legally bulletproof and practically enforceable. "And my attorney never noticed?" David's voice carried the tone of a man trying to understand how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. "Your attorney saw what he expected to see," I explained, settling into the chair across from him, with the composure of someone who held all the advantages. "A standard prenuptial agreement, designed to protect your assets in the event of divorce. The protective language was all there, clearly visible and heavily weighted in your favor. Article 13 appeared to be a mutual protection clause, applying equally to both parties. Nobody reads every word of a 47-page legal document when the first 30 pages give them everything they want." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had during our marriage. For the first time in years, David spoke to me without the careful manipulation and emotional distance that had characterized his communication style since the affair began. Perhaps it was the shock of losing everything, or maybe the whiskey, but he became almost vulnerable in his desperation to understand how completely he'd been defeated. "I thought I was being smart," he admitted, staring at the legal documents as if they might somehow change their meaning under scrutiny. "Bill assured me that the prenup would limit your claim to maybe 10% of the marital estate, plus minimal spousal support. Even if you found out about Jessica and fought the divorce, I figured I'd lose $20 million at most. I never imagined." "You never imagined that I might be smarter than your attorney," I finished for him. "That I might have anticipated your eventual betrayal and prepared accordingly." David looked up at me with something approaching awe mixed with terror. You've been planning my destruction since before we were even married. I've been protecting myself since before we were married, I corrected. Your destruction was your choice, David. Every hotel room with Jessica, every lie you told me about working late, every text message promising her a future together. I didn't force you to trigger Article 13. I just made sure I'd be protected when you did. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate David's shock-induced numbness. $82 million, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything I've worked for since college. Gone. Everything you built during our marriage, I clarified. The prenup protects your premarital assets. You'll keep the small apartment you owned when we met, your college savings account, and your 20-year-old Honda Civic. Roughly $40,000 in total assets. Not enough to impress Jessica, I'm afraid. The mention of his girlfriend's name caused David's composure to crack completely. His shoulders began to shake as the full scope of his losses became real to him. The business he'd built with Robert Anderson would survive, but David's ownership stake had been part of the marital estate and was now mine. The investment properties that had provided passive income were gone. The retirement accounts, the stock portfolios, the art collection, all of it transferred to me, as penalty for his adultery. What happens now? He asked finally, looking up at me with the expression of someone who'd lost everything and couldn't see a path forward. Now you learn to live with the consequences of your choices, I replied, standing to leave. The house will be sold, along with the Lake Travis property and the art collection. You have 30 days to remove your personal belongings, after which anything remaining becomes part of the estate sale. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face him one final time. David, in case you're wondering, I knew about Jessica from the beginning. The surveillance started 8 months ago, the day after she began working at your company. I've been documenting everything, waiting for you to cross the 6-month threshold that would trigger Article 13. You had every opportunity to end the affair and preserve your marriage and your fortune. Instead, you chose to continue pursuing someone young enough to be your daughter while plotting to divorce me in a way that would minimize your financial losses. David stared at me in stunned silence, finally understanding that his affair hadn't been the clever escape plan he'd imagined, but rather a carefully monitored walk toward financial suicide. The irony, I continued, is that if you'd simply asked for a divorce without the deception and adultery, we could have split our assets 50-50, and both walked away with comfortable lives. Your greed and your arrogance cost you everything. As I left our home for the final time, closing the door behind me on 7 years of marriage and a lifetime of memories, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Justice had been served with mathematical precision, but the victory felt hollow in ways I hadn't anticipated. David's betrayal had revealed fundamental flaws in his character that made me question whether I'd ever truly known the man I'd married, but it had also destroyed any possibility of the partnership I'd once hoped we might build together. The activation of Article 13 had been flawless in its execution, transferring David's entire fortune to me with legal efficiency that would be studied in law schools for years to come. But as I drove away from Westlake Hills toward my secret downtown penthouse, I realized that the most important victory wasn't financial but personal. I had protected myself from betrayal not through emotional walls or cynical detachment, but through careful planning and superior strategic thinking. David's assumption that he could manipulate and deceive me had been his fatal error, and the prenuptial agreement I'd crafted had been his punishment. The weeks following David's financial destruction unfolded, with the inexorable logic of a carefully constructed legal machine. Every provision I'd embedded in Article 13 activated precisely as designed, creating a cascade of consequences that stripped away not just his wealth, but his entire social and professional identity. Watching the systematic demolition of my husband's life from the safety of my downtown penthouse, I felt like a chess master observing the final moves of a game that had been determined years before the first piece was moved. The immediate aftermath was almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. David's business partner, Robert Anderson, moved quickly to protect Mitchell and Anderson Development from the legal chaos surrounding David's personal finances. Within 72 hours of the Article 13 activation, the company's board voted to buy out David's ownership stake at a price determined by the prenuptial agreement's valuation formulas. The transaction was swift and brutal, transferring David's 40% ownership interest to me for approximately $32 million, paid directly into accounts that he could no longer access. Robert's decision was purely pragmatic, driven by the need to preserve business relationships with clients and investors who were beginning to question the company's stability. The construction and development industry in Austin was built on personal reputation and financial credibility, both of which David had lost overnight. By severing ties with his former partner and friend, Robert was protecting hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in active projects from association with the scandal that had engulfed David's personal life. The social consequences were equally swift and comprehensive. Austin's elite circles, which had once welcomed David as a rising star in the city's business community, began treating him like a contagious disease. Invitations to charity events and networking functions simply stopped arriving. His name was quietly removed from the boards of several nonprofit organizations where his financial contributions had previously guaranteed his influence. The country club where we'd spent countless weekend afternoons revoked his membership when he could no longer afford the annual dues. Most devastating was the reaction from the younger professionals who had once sought David's mentorship and business connections. The real estate agents, architects, and contractors who had built their careers partly through association with Mitchell and Anderson Development began distancing themselves from David with ruthless efficiency. In Austin's relationship-driven business environment, being associated with financial scandal was often more damaging than actual criminal conviction. Jessica Chen's response to David's reduced circumstances was particularly illuminating. Marcus's surveillance revealed that she'd initially attempted to maintain their relationship, apparently believing that David's financial setback was temporary and that he would somehow recover his fortune through legal appeals or business maneuvers. Her optimism lasted exactly 6 days, ending when she realized that Article 13's provisions were legally bulletproof and that David's poverty was permanent rather than temporary. The breakup occurred at Jessica's apartment in the Domain, the same location where Marcus had photographed their intimate moments just weeks earlier. Through surveillance audio, I listened as David pleaded with her to stand by him during his legal and financial difficulties, promising that they could build a new life together despite his reduced circumstances. Jessica's response was clinical in its honesty. She'd fallen in love with a successful real estate developer who could provide her with luxury and security, not a middle-aged man with $40,000 in assets and no prospects for recovery. "I'm 26 years old, David," she said, with the kind of brutal clarity that only comes from absolute certainty. "I'm not going to spend the best years of my life struggling financially because you couldn't keep your business affairs separate from your personal life. This was supposed to be an upgrade from my previous relationships, not a step backward into poverty." David's reaction to Jessica's abandonment was a mixture of rage and desperation that revealed aspects of his personality I'd never seen during our marriage. He alternated between blaming me for destroying his life through legal trickery and cursing Jessica for her shallow materialism. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable to observe. He seemed genuinely surprised that a woman who'd entered a relationship with a married millionaire might be motivated primarily by financial rather than emotional considerations. The legal proceedings moved forward with clockwork precision, guided by the detailed enforcement mechanisms I'd built into the prenuptial agreement. James Sullivan filed motion after motion, each one designed to tighten the legal noose around David's remaining assets while preventing any possibility of appeal or delay. The beauty of Article 13's construction was that it left virtually no room for legal maneuvering. David had signed the agreement voluntarily, with full legal representation, after extensive review and negotiation. The triggering conditions had been met beyond any possible challenge, and the financial calculations were mathematically precise. David's attorney Bill Hayes made several desperate attempts to challenge the prenuptial agreement's validity, arguing that the liquidated damages provision was punitive, rather than compensatory and therefore unenforceable under Texas law. His motions claimed that Article 13 constituted an invalid penalty clause designed to coerce marital behavior, rather than simply protect financial interests. The arguments were creative but ultimately futile, as I'd anticipated such challenges and crafted the language to withstand exactly this type of legal attack. The key to Article 13's enforceability was its structure as a liquidated damages provision rather than a penalty clause. Texas law distinguishes between these two concepts, based on whether the predetermined consequences bear a reasonable relationship to the actual harm caused by breach of contract. I'd spent considerable time researching court decisions and academic analyses to ensure that the 150% multiplier and accumulated interest provisions would be viewed as reasonable compensation for the unique damages caused by marital infidelity rather than arbitrary punishment. The legal reasoning was sophisticated but straightforward. Adultery in a high net worth marriage causes damages that extend far beyond simple emotional harm. The betrayed spouse faces social humiliation, professional embarrassment, and long-term financial insecurity that are difficult to quantify through traditional damage calculations. By predetermining these consequences through mutual agreement during prenuptial negotiations, both parties were simply acknowledging the full scope of potential harm and agreeing to compensation that reflected the true cost of marital betrayal. Judge Patricia Morrison, who presided over our divorce proceedings, was widely regarded as one of Austin's most knowledgeable family law jurists. Her decision on Bill Hayes's motion to invalidate Article 13 was thorough and decisive, rejecting every argument that David's legal team had presented. Her written opinion noted that both parties had been represented by experienced attorneys during prenuptial negotiations, that the agreement's terms had been extensively reviewed and modified through multiple drafts, and that the final document reflected genuine bargaining between sophisticated parties with full understanding of its implications. Most importantly, Judge Morrison's opinion established legal precedent that would influence prenuptial agreement enforcement throughout Texas for years to come. Her analysis of liquidated damages provisions in marital contracts was cited in legal journals and academic publications, establishing my prenuptial agreement as a landmark case study in family law innovation. The irony was exquisite. David's affair had not only destroyed his personal fortune, but had also created legal precedent that would help other betrayed spouses protect themselves from similar marital misconduct. The practical implementation of David's asset transfer was handled with the same precision that had characterized the legal proceedings. Court-appointed forensic accountants conducted comprehensive audits of all properties and investments that had been acquired during our marriage, ensuring that every dollar was properly identified and transferred according to Article 13's provisions. The process was exhaustive and humiliating for David, who was required to provide detailed documentation of every financial transaction he'd conducted during our 7-year marriage. The real estate portfolio was particularly valuable, including not just our primary residence in Westlake Hills and the Lake Travis vacation home, but also several investment properties that David had acquired through his development company. The forensic accountants determined that these properties had appreciated by an average of 18% annually during our marriage, driven by Austin's explosive population growth and the corresponding demand for luxury housing. The total real estate value exceeded $48 million, all of which transferred to me under the prenuptial agreement's terms. The art collection that we'd assembled during our marriage represented another significant asset transfer, though one that carried particular emotional weight. David had prided himself on his sophisticated taste in contemporary art, spending considerable time and money acquiring pieces from both established and emerging artists. The collection included works by several Austin-based artists who had gained national recognition during our marriage, as well as pieces from galleries in New York and Los Angeles that David had purchased during our business travels. The court-appointed appraiser valued the art collection at approximately $3.2 million, but its significance to David extended far beyond monetary worth. Each piece represented a carefully considered aesthetic decision and a validation of his cultural sophistication. Losing the collection was particularly devastating because it stripped away one of the primary ways David had distinguished himself from other successful businessmen in Austin's competitive social environment. The liquidation process was conducted with professional efficiency but personal ruthlessness. Sotheby's auction house agreed to handle the sale of the most valuable pieces, while local galleries were enlisted to dispose of works by regional artists. The entire collection would be sold within 90 days, with proceeds deposited directly into accounts controlled by my legal team. David was permitted to attend the auctions if he chose, but he would be watching strangers purchase the art that had once defined his personal taste and cultural identity. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was the disposal of David's vintage car collection, which had been his primary personal passion outside of business and golf. The collection included a 1967 Shelby Cobra, a 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera, and a 1965 Ford Mustang convertible that he'd restored personally during the early years of our marriage. These vehicles represented thousands of hours of meticulous work and tens of thousands of dollars in restoration costs, but they were also symbols of David's identity as someone who appreciated mechanical excellence and automotive history. The car collections auction drew attention from collectors throughout Texas and neighboring states, with bidding that exceeded the appraiser's estimates by nearly 30%. David attended the sale despite the obvious emotional cost, sitting in the back row and watching potential buyers examine the vehicles he'd spent years perfecting. When the final hammer fell on the Shelby Cobra, which sold for $240,000 to a collector from Dallas, David walked out of the auction house without looking back. The systematic destruction of David's material world was matched by the equally comprehensive collapse of his professional reputation. Word of the massive prenuptial settlement spread throughout Austin's business community with remarkable speed, generating conversations that ranged from admiration for my legal strategy to warnings about the dangers of underestimating one's spouse. David became a cautionary tale told at business lunches and networking events, the successful developer who'd lost everything because he'd assumed his wife was less intelligent than his attorney. The professional consequences extended beyond simple embarrassment to actual business impact. Potential clients who might once have sought David's expertise in real estate development now viewed him as someone who demonstrated catastrophically poor judgment in his personal life. If he couldn't manage his own marriage and finances successfully, prospective partners wondered, how could he be trusted with their investment capital and development projects? Moreover, David's reduced financial circumstances made it virtually impossible for him to participate in the kind of real estate deals that had built his fortune. Development projects in Austin's competitive market required significant personal capital and the ability to provide financial guarantees to construction lenders. Without access to substantial assets, David couldn't qualify for the credit facilities that were essential to real estate development, effectively ending his career in the industry that had defined his professional identity. The psychological impact of losing everything he'd worked to build since college was evident in David's increasingly erratic behavior. Marcus's surveillance revealed a man struggling with depression and anxiety, spending days in his modest apartment, drinking heavily, and making desperate phone calls to former business associates who were no longer returning his messages. The confident, charismatic real estate developer had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely bewildered by the speed and completeness of his downfall. Most telling was David's inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his own choices. In recorded conversations with the few friends who still maintained contact with him, he consistently portrayed himself as the victim of legal trickery rather than the architect of his own destruction. He seemed genuinely to believe that his affair with Jessica had been a minor marital indiscretion that didn't warrant the devastating financial penalties imposed by Article 13. This self-deception was perhaps the most pathetic aspect of David's situation. Even after losing everything, he couldn't acknowledge that his systematic deception and planned abandonment of our marriage had justified the consequences he was experiencing. His inability to recognize the connection between his choices and their results suggested a fundamental character flaw that made me question whether any reconciliation would have been possible, even if he'd ended the affair voluntarily. 3 months after the Article 13 activation, I received an unexpected phone call from Robert Anderson, David's former business partner, and the man who'd been forced to buy out his ownership stake to protect their company. Robert requested a private meeting to discuss what he described as, quote, David's situation and its impact on mutual friends and business associates. The careful phrasing suggested that he was approaching me not as David's advocate, but as someone concerned about the broader consequences of the scandal. We met at the Four Seasons Austin, in the same restaurant where David and I had celebrated our third wedding anniversary and where, according to Marcus's surveillance, David had later brought Jessica for intimate dinners during their affair. Robert appeared uncomfortable and slightly nervous, clearly struggling with the awkward position of addressing his former partner's ex-wife about matters that were both personal and professional. "Sarah, I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened," Robert began carefully. "David made his choices, and the consequences were clearly specified in legal documents that he signed voluntarily. But I'm concerned about his current state of mind, and the possibility that he might do something desperate or self-destructive." The concern was warranted. Marcus's surveillance had revealed increasingly troubling behavior patterns, including excessive drinking, erratic sleep schedules, and conversations with questionable individuals who seemed to be encouraging David to pursue illegal or unethical strategies for recovering his lost fortune. There had been discussions about hidden assets that might have escaped the forensic accountant's attention, and suggestions that certain business documents could be altered or destroyed to create false claims against the prenuptial agreement's enforcement. Robert's warning carried implicit recognition that David's psychological state was deteriorating in ways that could pose risks, not just to himself, but to others, who might become collateral damage in any desperate attempts to recover his losses. The conversation was a stark reminder that legal victories, however comprehensive and satisfying, could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate parties to a dispute. After Robert left, I sat in the restaurant for an additional hour, contemplating the full scope of what I'd accomplished through Article 13's activation. The financial transfer had been everything I'd hoped for and more, providing me with resources that would ensure complete independence for the rest of my life. The legal precedent would protect other spouses from similar betrayals for decades to come. The social consequences had been swift and appropriate, removing David from positions of influence and respect that he'd abused through his marital misconduct. But Robert's warning about David's psychological state forced me to confront the human cost of my comprehensive victory. The man who'd betrayed our marriage vows and planned to abandon me with minimal financial support was now genuinely struggling with depression and desperation that could lead to self-harm or worse. While I felt no responsibility for David's choices or their consequences, I couldn't entirely ignore the possibility that my legal strategy had pushed him toward a psychological breaking point that could have tragic results. The complexity of these emotions surprised me. I'd expected to feel satisfaction and vindication when Article 13 was finally activated, and those feelings were certainly present. But I'd also anticipated that justice served would bring a sense of closure and peace that would allow me to move forward with my life. Instead, I found myself constantly monitoring David's behavior through Marcus's surveillance, partly from concern about potential retaliation, but also from genuine worry about his psychological welfare. Perhaps this ambivalence was inevitable when personal relationships intersected with legal and financial warfare. David had been my husband for 7 years, and despite his betrayal and the calculated cruelty of his planned abandonment, I couldn't completely separate my emotional response to his suffering from my intellectual satisfaction with Article 13's success. The prenuptial agreement had functioned exactly as designed, but human emotions were more complicated than legal mechanisms, resistant to the precise control that contract law could provide. As I finally left the Four Seasons and drove back to my downtown penthouse, I realized that the most challenging phase of my journey was just beginning. The legal victory was complete, the financial transfer was finalized, and David's ability to harm me further had been eliminated. But the process of building a new life with the resources and freedom I'd secured would require different skills than those I'd used to protect myself from betrayal. Article 13 had been my shield and sword in the battle against David's deception, but it couldn't provide the emotional framework I'd need to move beyond the defensive strategies that had defined my life for the past 8 months. The woman who'd crafted that devastating prenuptial clause 7 years ago had been planning for the possibility of betrayal, while hoping it would never be necessary. The woman who'd executed Article 13 with ruthless efficiency had been focused entirely on protecting herself from the consequences of her husband's infidelity. Now I needed to become someone different, a person who could use her hard-won independence and substantial resources to create a life defined by possibility rather than protection, by building rather than defending, by hope rather than vigilance. 7 years earlier, when David first suggested that we needed a prenuptial agreement, I'd interpreted his proposal as evidence of practical wisdom rather than calculated self-interest. We were both successful professionals with substantial individual assets, and the idea of clarifying our financial expectations before marriage seemed reasonable and mature. David presented the prenup as mutual protection that would allow us to build our life together without the uncertainty that could undermine trust and communication in our relationship. "I've seen too many couples destroy each other in divorce court," David had explained during one of our prenuptial discussions, his tone serious and seemingly thoughtful. "When people are hurt and angry, they stop thinking clearly about fairness and start focusing on revenge. A good prenuptial agreement removes that temptation by predetermining how assets would be divided, so both parties know exactly what to expect if the marriage doesn't work out." His reasoning seemed sound at the time, particularly given my own legal background and understanding of how bitter divorce proceedings could become. I'd represented corporate clients in contentious partnership dissolutions that had destroyed not just business relationships but personal friendships and family connections. The idea of establishing clear ground rules for our own relationship seemed like exactly the kind of mature planning that would distinguish our marriage from the emotional chaos that characterized many failed relationships. What I didn't recognize then was that David's interest in prenuptial protection wasn't driven by general concern about divorce proceedings, but by specific awareness of his own character flaws and behavioral patterns. The transformation of our marriage from genuine partnership to calculated performance began so gradually that I didn't recognize it was happening until the damage was already extensive. Looking back through the lens of David's ultimate betrayal, I can identify the precise moments when our relationship shifted from collaborative to transactional, though at the time these changes seemed like natural evolution rather than deliberate manipulation. The first significant indicator came during our second year of marriage, when I was offered a position as general counsel for a rapidly growing technology company based in downtown Austin. The role represented a substantial career advancement, with compensation that would have exceeded David's income from Mitchell and Anderson development, and stock options that could potentially be worth millions if the company went public. The position would also have required extensive travel and long hours during the company's planned expansion into international markets. David's reaction to this opportunity was subtle but telling. Rather than celebrating my potential advancement, he expressed concern about how the demanding schedule might affect our marriage and our plans to start a family. He worried aloud about the strain that frequent travel would place on our relationship and questioned whether the financial benefits were worth the personal sacrifices that would be required. His arguments were reasonable and caring on the surface, but they consistently emphasized the risks rather than the opportunities associated with the position. "I'm not saying you shouldn't take it," David said during one of our discussions about the job offer, his tone carefully modulated to sound supportive rather than controlling. "I just want to make sure you've considered all the implications. We've built something good together, and I'd hate to see career pressures damage what we have. The money sounds attractive, but we're already financially comfortable. Is it worth potentially compromising our marriage for a salary increase?" The framing was masterful in its psychological sophistication. David positioned himself as the protector of our relationship, while making me responsible for any negative consequences that might result from pursuing my career ambitions. He wasn't forbidding me from taking the position, which would have been obviously controlling, but he was creating emotional pressure that made acceptance feel selfish and potentially destructive to our marriage. I ultimately declined the position, a decision that I rationalized as prioritizing our relationship over individual career advancement. At the time, the choice felt mature and collaborative, evidence that I was committed to building our life together rather than pursuing solely personal goals. Only years later would I recognize it as the first major compromise in a series of decisions that gradually diminished my professional identity and independence. The pattern repeated itself in various forms over the following years. When I was invited to join the board of directors for a prominent Austin nonprofit organization, David expressed concern about the time commitment and the potential for conflicts of interest with his own business relationships. When a former law school classmate approached me about joining her litigation boutique as a senior partner, David worried about the stress of starting a new practice and the financial risks associated with leaving the security of Rodriguez and Associates. Each individual objection was reasonable and presented with apparent concern for my well-being and our shared interests. Taken together, however, They created a systematic pattern of discouragement that gradually narrowed my professional options and reduced my independence. David never explicitly forbade me from pursuing opportunities, but he consistently raised concerns that made acceptance feel irresponsible or disloyal to our marriage. The social dimension of this control was even more sophisticated. David had definite opinions about our social circle and the events we attended, preferences that he presented as shared values rather than personal requirements. He preferred business-oriented social gatherings, where conversations focused on real estate development, investment opportunities, and Austin's economic growth. Cultural events, artistic performances, and intellectual discussions that didn't directly relate to business were tolerated but clearly not encouraged. Our dinner parties became carefully curated networking opportunities rather than occasions for personal enjoyment or intellectual stimulation. Guest lists were developed based on potential business value, with seating arrangements designed to facilitate conversations that could benefit David's development projects. I gradually found myself playing the role of hostess and facilitator rather than participant, ensuring that drinks were refreshed and conversations flowed smoothly while David positioned himself as the evening's primary attraction. The transformation was so gradual that I didn't recognize how completely my social identity had been subsumed into David's professional needs. Friends from law school and former colleagues who didn't fit into David's business-focused social framework gradually faded from our lives, not through explicit exclusion, but through subtle discouragement and scheduling conflicts that made maintaining those relationships increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, David's own social circle expanded to include real estate developers, construction contractors, city council members, and other individuals who could provide business opportunities or political influence. These relationships were cultivated with strategic precision, with David investing considerable time and resources in maintaining connections that could benefit his professional goals. Our home became a venue for advancing his career, rather than a private space where we could relax and enjoy each other's company. The financial control was implemented with similar subtlety. David suggested that consolidating our assets would provide tax advantages and simplify our financial management, arguments that were technically accurate and presented with apparent concern for efficiency rather than control. Our individual bank accounts were closed and replaced with joint accounts that provided David with complete visibility into my spending patterns and financial activities. Investment decisions were handled through David's financial advisors, who reported directly to him about our portfolio performance and strategic recommendations. I received quarterly summaries of our holdings and returns, but the detailed decision-making process was managed by David and his team. This arrangement was presented as a logical division of labor, based on David's superior knowledge of financial markets and investment strategies. The consolidation meant that I lost direct control over my own assets, while gaining little meaningful input into how our combined wealth was managed. David's business connections provided access to investment opportunities that weren't available to individual investors, and his financial team certainly generated impressive returns on our portfolio. But the price of this financial success was my independence and my ability to make autonomous decisions about my own economic future. Most insidiously, David gradually began rewriting the history of my professional achievements to minimize my contributions and elevate his own role in our shared success. When we attended business functions or social events, he would introduce me as his wife, who'd been fortunate enough to work at one of Austin's prestigious law firms, language that suggested my career had been more about luck than skill or hard work. My successful exit from the cybersecurity company became our exit in David's retelling, with him taking credit for providing strategic advice that had enhanced the company's value and attractiveness to potential acquirers. The reality was that David had shown minimal interest in my company's technology, and had provided no meaningful input into the business decisions that had led to the successful sale. But his version of events positioned him as a key advisor whose financial expertise had been crucial to the outcome. These narrative revisions served multiple purposes. They enhanced David's reputation as a strategic thinker whose insights extended beyond real estate development into technology and corporate finance. They also diminished my perceived contributions to our shared wealth, making it seem reasonable that David should have primary control over investment decisions and financial planning. Most importantly, they gradually eroded my own confidence in my professional abilities and achievements. The psychological impact of this systematic diminishment was cumulative and devastating. Over the course of several years, I went from being a confident, successful attorney with a clear sense of professional identity to someone who increasingly doubted her own judgment and relied on David's guidance for important decisions. The transformation was so gradual that I didn't recognize it was happening until the pattern was already well established. David's control techniques were sophisticated enough that they never felt overtly manipulative or abusive. He didn't forbid me from pursuing opportunities or maintaining friendships. He simply created emotional and practical barriers that made those choices increasingly difficult to sustain. He didn't explicitly claim credit for my achievements. He simply reframed them in ways that emphasized his contributions while minimizing mine. The genius of his approach was that it made me complicit in my own diminishment. Every decision to decline a professional opportunity or abandon a personal relationship felt like my choice, made for reasonable reasons with David's support and encouragement. I wasn't being controlled. I was being guided toward decisions that would strengthen our marriage and advance our shared interests. By our 5th year of marriage, the transformation was complete. I had evolved from an independent professional with her own career ambitions and social connections into someone whose identity was almost entirely defined by her relationship to David and his success. My legal work had become a hobby rather than a career, providing intellectual stimulation and modest income but no real independence or professional advancement. Our social life revolved entirely around David's business relationships and networking needs. Our financial decisions were made by David's advisors according to strategies that I understood only in general terms. Our home had become a showcase for David's success rather than a private retreat where we could relax and enjoy each other's company without performing for others. Most critically, I had lost the ability to imagine a life independent of David and the framework he'd constructed around our marriage. The financial consolidation meant that leaving would be economically devastating, requiring me to rebuild my career and social connections from a position of significant disadvantage. The social isolation meant that I had few relationships that could provide emotional support or practical assistance if I needed to escape an unhappy marriage. The psychological conditioning was so thorough that I couldn't even clearly identify what was wrong with our relationship. David was never cruel or obviously manipulative. He was supportive of my career within the boundaries he'd established, encouraging of my friendships as long as they didn't conflict with his social priorities, and generous with resources, as long as spending decisions were made through channels he controlled. If I expressed dissatisfaction or restlessness, David would point to our material success and social standing as evidence that our marriage was thriving. We lived in a beautiful home, traveled extensively, maintained an active social life, and were widely regarded as one of Austin's most successful young couples. What more could I reasonably want from our relationship? The question was both genuine and manipulative. David seemed to truly believe that material success and social recognition were sufficient foundations for marital happiness, and he couldn't understand why I might want greater independence or more authentic emotional connection. His confusion was sincere, but it also served to invalidate my feelings and make me question whether my dissatisfaction was reasonable or simply evidence of ingratitude for the lifestyle he'd provided. This psychological framework made it almost impossible to recognize David's affair when it began, even though the signs were obvious in retrospect. I had been so thoroughly conditioned to doubt my own perceptions and defer to David's superior judgment that I initially dismissed the evidence of his infidelity as paranoia or insecurity on my part. When David began working later hours and traveling more frequently, I accepted his explanations about increased business demands and competitive pressures in Austin's real estate market. When he became more secretive about his phone conversations and email communications, I assumed it was related to confidential business negotiations that required discretion. When his physical and emotional availability decreased, I blamed my own inadequacies as a wife, rather than questioning whether he might be investing his energy elsewhere. The conditioning was so complete that I actively resisted recognizing the truth about David's behavior, even when that truth was staring me in the face. I had been trained to see myself as the problem in our relationship rather than David, to question my own judgment rather than his honesty, to accept his explanations rather than trust my own observations. This psychological vulnerability made David's eventual betrayal even more devastating than it might have been in a healthier relationship. I wasn't just losing a husband and a marriage. I was losing the entire identity I'd constructed around being David's wife and partner. The financial control meant that I would also be losing economic security and social standing, facing the prospect of rebuilding my life from a position of significant disadvantage. But the same legal training that David had systematically undermined also provided me with the tools I would need to protect myself from his planned abandonment. My understanding of contract law and prenuptial agreements allowed me to recognize the vulnerabilities in the document David had asked me to sign, and to craft a counterargument that would ultimately destroy him rather than protect his assets. The irony was that David's own controlling behavior had created the conditions that made Article 13 possible. If he had maintained our marriage as a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared decision-making, I might never have felt the need to embed such devastating protection clauses in our prenuptial agreement. His systematic diminishment of my independence and identity had awakened my dormant survival instincts, leading me to prepare for the betrayal that his behavior made increasingly inevitable. The 7 months I spent crafting the prenuptial agreement with Patricia Rodriguez were simultaneously the most intense and most liberating period of our entire relationship. For the first time in years, I was using my full intellectual capabilities to solve a complex problem, drawing on legal knowledge and strategic thinking that David had gradually discouraged me from exercising. The work reminded me of who I had been before our marriage, and who I could become again if I ever escaped David's control. Working with Patricia also provided me with the first honest relationship I'd maintained in years. She saw through David's charm and manipulation immediately, recognizing him as a narcissist who viewed marriage as a business transaction, rather than an emotional partnership. Her validation of my concerns and her enthusiasm for my legal strategy helped restore my confidence in my own judgment and professional abilities. "You realize," Patricia said during one of our strategy sessions, "that you're not just protecting yourself financially. You're creating a legal mechanism that will expose David's true character and destroy the carefully constructed image he's built in Austin's business community. When this clause is triggered, everyone will see him as he really is. A man who betrayed his marriage vows and tried to steal his wife's assets through legal manipulation." The insight was prescient. Article 13 wasn't just about money or asset protection. It was about justice and accountability for someone who had systematically abused the trust and vulnerability that marriage relationships require. David had used our marriage as a vehicle for enhancing his own success, while gradually undermining my independence and identity. The prenuptial clause would ensure that his eventual betrayal would cost him everything he valued, rather than providing him with the clean escape he was planning. The months of preparation also allowed me to begin rebuilding the social and professional connections that David had gradually severed. I reconnected with former law school classmates who had built successful practices in Austin and other cities. I renewed friendships with colleagues from Rodriguez and Associates who had wondered why I had become so socially isolated during my marriage. I began attending cultural events and intellectual gatherings that David had consistently discouraged. This gradual reconnection with my authentic self and my pre-marriage identity provided the emotional foundation I would need to survive David's betrayal and its aftermath. By the time his affair began, I was already well into the process of psychological recovery from the systematic diminishment I'd experienced during our marriage. The financial and legal protections provided by Article 13 were crucial, but they wouldn't have been sufficient without the parallel work of rebuilding my sense of self-worth and independence. The woman who discovered David's affair 8 months ago was fundamentally different from the woman who had married him 7 years earlier. The naive attorney who had trusted her husband's financial management and social guidance had evolved into someone who understood the importance of maintaining independent resources and relationships. The process of crafting and implementing Article 13 had restored not just my legal acumen, but my psychological resilience and strategic thinking abilities. David's affair was devastating, but it wasn't surprising. The systematic control and emotional manipulation that had characterized our marriage for years had made his eventual betrayal almost inevitable. Someone who viewed marriage as a business transaction and treated his wife as a managed asset was unlikely to maintain long-term fidelity when more attractive opportunities presented themselves. What surprised David was discovering that his carefully controlled wife had retained enough independence and strategic capability to destroy him, rather than simply accepting his planned abandonment. The prenuptial agreement he had thought would protect his assets had actually been weaponized against him by someone whose legal skills he had consistently underestimated, and whose survival instincts he had accidentally awakened through his own controlling behavior. The 7 years of our marriage had been David's education in the dangers of underestimating one's opponent though he wouldn't recognize the lesson until it was far too late to benefit from it. His systematic efforts to control and diminish me had actually prepared me to defeat him more thoroughly than any straightforward conflict could have accomplished. By teaching me to doubt myself, he had forced me to develop sophisticated defense mechanisms. By isolating me from my support networks, he had motivated me to build new and stronger connections. By taking control of our finances, he had inspired me to create independent resources that he couldn't access or monitor. Article 13 was the culmination of this education, a legal masterpiece that converted David's own controlling behavior into the mechanism of his destruction. The prenuptial agreement wasn't just a contract, it was a perfect trap, disguised as protection, but actually serving as punishment for the betrayal that David's character made inevitable. As I prepared to trigger that trap and watch David's world collapse, I realized that our marriage had been the most valuable education I'd ever received. It had taught me to recognize manipulation and control before they became entrenched. It had shown me the importance of maintaining independent resources in relationships regardless of how secure a partnership might appear. Most importantly, it had revealed my own capacity for strategic thinking and long-term planning under extreme pressure. David believed he was abandoning a diminished, dependent wife who would be devastated by his betrayal and grateful for whatever settlement his lawyers deemed appropriate. Instead, he was about to discover that he had unknowingly trained his most dangerous adversary, someone who had spent years studying his weaknesses and preparing for the opportunity to exploit them completely. The woman who would activate Article 13 and destroy David's life was his own creation, shaped by years of subtle abuse and systematic control into someone who understood that survival required not just intelligence, but ruthless execution of carefully laid plans. David had taught me everything I needed to know about him to defeat him utterly, and he had done it while believing he was creating the perfect subordinate wife. The education was about to end, and the final examination would determine whether the teacher or the student emerged victorious from 7 years of carefully disguised warfare. The morning of David's complete surrender arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed to mirror the precision of my legal victory. 6 weeks had passed since Article 13's activation, and every mechanism I'd embedded in that devastating clause had functioned with clockwork efficiency. David's financial empire had been systematically dismantled, his social standing had evaporated, and his relationship with Jessica had collapsed under the weight of his sudden poverty. Now came the final act, his formal acknowledgement that the game was over and that he had lost everything. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at James Sullivan's law office, in the same conference room where I'd first reviewed the forensic accountant's reports detailing David's hidden assets and systematic deception. David arrived exactly on time, a small mercy that suggested he was still clinging to some vestige of professional dignity despite his utterly compromised circumstances. He was accompanied by Bill Hayes, his attorney, whose haggard appearance testified to the impossible position he'd been placed in while trying to defend the legally indefensible. I watched through the conference room's interior windows as David waited in the reception area, noting how completely his physical presence had changed since the day he'd confidently served me with divorce papers. The expensive suits had been replaced with off-the-rack clothing that hung awkwardly on his frame. His usually perfect grooming showed signs of neglect, with hair that needed cutting and a complexion that spoke of too much alcohol and too little sleep. Most tellingly, the confident bearing that had once made him the center of attention in any room had been replaced by the hunched posture of someone who expected each new day to bring fresh humiliation. When James finally escorted them into the conference room, the power dynamic was immediately and unmistakably clear. David avoided eye contact, focusing instead on the legal documents that covered the conference table, like evidence in a criminal trial. Bill Hayes attempted to maintain professional composure, but his nervous energy betrayed the hopelessness of his client's position. They were here to surrender, not to negotiate, and everyone in the room understood that reality. "David," I said simply, my voice carrying no trace of triumph or vindictiveness. The destruction of his life had been comprehensive enough that gloating would have been both unnecessary and undignified. "I trust you've had sufficient time to review the final settlement calculations." He nodded without looking up, his voice barely audible when he finally spoke. $87 million. The figure had grown by nearly $5 million since our initial calculations, thanks to the accumulated interest provisions and the enhanced valuations that had emerged during the forensic accounting process. Everything I've worked for since college. Everything you accumulated during our marriage, I corrected gently. The prenuptial agreement was quite specific about protecting premarital assets. You'll retain ownership of your original apartment and your college savings account, just as Article 13 specified. The distinction was important, both legally and psychologically. David wasn't being rendered completely destitute. He was being returned to the financial position he'd occupied when we met, minus 7 years of what he'd assumed would be consequence-free wealth accumulation. The symmetry was almost poetic. The successful real estate developer who'd planned to abandon his wife with minimal assets was now facing exactly the same prospect himself. Bill Hayes cleared his throat and attempted to fulfill his professional obligations despite the futility of his position. Mrs. Mitchell, my client would like to know if there's any possibility of negotiating a modified settlement that would allow him to retain sufficient assets to continue his business operations. He's prepared to transfer the majority of the marital estate, as specified in Article 13, but he's hoping you might consider allowing him to keep enough capital to maintain his real estate development activities. The request was both pathetic and predictable. David still didn't understand that Article 13 wasn't a negotiating position, but a mathematical formula that had already calculated his exact punishment for marital infidelity. The clause left no room for judicial discretion or modification based on changed circumstances. The consequences were predetermined and absolute, designed specifically to prevent the kind of post-betrayal bargaining that Bill was attempting. The prenuptial agreement contains no provisions for modification of Article 13's enforcement, James replied with professional precision. The liquidated damages calculation was specifically designed to be comprehensive and final, preventing exactly the kind of negotiation you're suggesting. Mrs. Mitchell has no legal authority to reduce the specified penalties, even if she were inclined to do so. David finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since entering the conference room. The expression I saw there was complex. Anger, desperation, and something that might have been genuine remorse, though whether for his actions or simply their consequences was impossible to determine. You planned this from the beginning, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of accusation and grudging admiration. The whole prenuptial negotiation was a setup. You knew I would eventually betray you, and you prepared accordingly. I planned for the possibility, I replied honestly. I hoped it would never be necessary, but I wasn't naive enough to assume that hope was sufficient protection. Your affair with Jessica simply activated legal mechanisms that had been dormant for 7 years. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had during our marriage. For the first time in years, David spoke to me without the calculated charm and emotional manipulation that had characterized his communication style since the early stages of his systematic control campaign. Perhaps it was the shock of losing everything, or maybe the whiskey I could smell on his breath despite the early hour. But he became almost brutally honest about his motivations and his assessment of our relationship. I thought I was being smart, he admitted, staring down at the settlement documents as if they might somehow change their meaning under closer scrutiny. The prenup was supposed to protect me from exactly this kind of financial disaster. Bill assured me that the language would limit your claim to maybe 20% of the marital estate, even if you discovered the affair and decided to fight the divorce aggressively. Your attorney saw what he expected to see, I explained, feeling oddly compelled to help David understand the scope of his miscalculation. A standard asset protection agreement designed to shield your wealth from an angry spouse. The protective language was all clearly visible and heavily weighted in your favor. Article 13 appeared to be a mutual fidelity clause that would apply equally to both parties. Nobody reads every word of a 47-page legal document when the first 30 pages give them everything they want. Bill Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing his professional failure, but unable to adequately explain how he'd missed the most devastating clause in the history of Texas family law. His reputation would never recover from this oversight, and he knew it. The David Mitchell prenuptial agreement would become a cautionary tale told in law schools and continuing education seminars for decades to come. How long did you know about Jessica? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. From the beginning, I replied. I hired Marcus Thompson to conduct surveillance the day after she started working at your company. I've been documenting your relationship for 8 months, waiting for you to cross the 6-month threshold that would trigger Article 13. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. His face drained of what little color it had retained, and his hands began to shake as he processed the implications of what I'd just told him. For 8 months, he'd been walking deeper into a carefully constructed legal trap, while believing he was executing a clever escape plan. Every hotel room, every intimate dinner, every weekend getaway had been monitored and documented, building the comprehensive case that would ultimately destroy him. "You could have stopped me," he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. "You could have confronted me after the first month and demanded that I end it. Instead, you let me continue until I'd passed the point of no return." "I could have," I agreed, "but that would have required trusting that you would honor any agreement to end the affair, and trusting that you wouldn't simply become more careful about hiding future infidelities." Article 13 was designed to eliminate the possibility of repeat offenses by making the consequences so devastating that no rational person would risk triggering them. The logic was unassailable, though clearly painful for David to accept. I had treated his affair not as a relationship problem to be solved through communication and counseling, but as a contract violation that required enforcement according to predetermined penalties. The approach was coldly legal rather than emotionally therapeutic, but it had also been completely effective in protecting my interests. "What happens now?" David asked, finally acknowledging that the settlement was inevitable, and that his only remaining option was to understand the practical implications of his financial destruction. "The asset transfer will be completed within 30 days, James explained, consulting the timeline we'd established for liquidating David's holdings. "The real estate properties will be sold through coordinated auctions to maximize market value. The investment portfolios will be transferred to accounts controlled by Mrs. Mitchell's financial team. Your business ownership stake in Mitchell and Anderson Development has already been purchased by the company at the valuation specified in your prenuptial agreement." The process was comprehensive and irreversible, designed to prevent David from hiding assets or manipulating valuations to reduce his ultimate financial exposure. Every piece of property, every investment account, every business interest that had been acquired during our marriage would be systematically identified, appraised, and transferred according to Article 13 specifications. "You'll retain ownership of your premarital assets," I added, wanting to be completely clear about what David would be left with after the settlement was finalized. "The apartment you owned when we met, your college savings account, and your 1999 Honda Civic. Approximately $42,000 in total value." The number was precise and devastating. David would emerge from our divorce with less money than many recent college graduates possessed, forced to rebuild his entire life from a position that was actually worse than where he'd started his career 15 years earlier. The real estate development industry that had made him wealthy required significant capital and established relationships, both of which he'd now lost permanently. More crucially, David's reputation in Austin's business community had been so thoroughly destroyed that rebuilding would be virtually impossible, even if he somehow acquired startup capital. The scandal of the massive prenuptial settlement had been covered extensively in local media, creating a public record of his adultery and financial destruction that would follow him indefinitely. Potential business partners, clients, and investors would always wonder whether someone who demonstrated such catastrophically poor judgment in his personal life could be trusted with their money and projects. The meeting continued for another hour as we worked through the administrative details of David's complete financial surrender. Documents were signed transferring ownership of properties and accounts. Powers of attorney were executed, allowing my legal team to complete transactions on his behalf. Insurance policies were modified to reflect changed beneficiaries and coverage requirements. Throughout this process, David maintained an eerie composure that seemed almost dissociative. He signed each document mechanically, as if the papers represented someone else's life rather than his own complete destruction. Bill Hayes provided minimal guidance, recognizing that his client's situation was so hopeless that detailed legal advice would only prolong the inevitable. The final document David signed was a comprehensive waiver, acknowledging that the settlement was complete and that he had no further claims against the marital estate or against me personally. The waiver also included a non-disclosure clause preventing him from discussing the specific terms of our prenuptial agreement or the circumstances of its enforcement. This provision was designed to protect both my privacy and the legal strategies I'd employed, ensuring that future spouses couldn't learn from David's experience to better protect themselves from similar consequences. As the meeting concluded and David prepared to leave James's office for the final time, he paused at the conference room door and turned back to face me. The expression on his face was complex, mixing residual anger with what appeared to be genuine curiosity about the woman he'd been married to for 7 years, but had never truly known. "Sarah," he said quietly, "if I'd ended the affair voluntarily after a few months, would you have forgiven me? Would we have been able to rebuild our marriage?" The question was both profound and heartbreaking, touching on possibilities that could never be explored and hypothetical futures that would never exist. I considered my response carefully, understanding that my answer would probably be the last meaningful communication between us. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "The affair was a symptom of deeper problems in our marriage, problems that existed long before Jessica entered your life. You spent years systematically undermining my independence and autonomy, treating me as an asset to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. Even if you'd ended the affair voluntarily, I'm not sure we could have addressed those fundamental issues." David nodded slowly, apparently recognizing the truth in my assessment, even if he couldn't fully accept responsibility for the dynamics I'd described. He'd entered our marriage viewing relationships as transactions to be optimized for his benefit, and he'd never developed the emotional skills necessary for genuine partnership and mutual respect. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I'm sorry. Not just for the affair, but for everything. For taking you for granted. For trying to control you. For never seeing you clearly enough to appreciate what I had." The apology was more comprehensive, and seemingly genuine, than anything I'd expected from David, though whether it reflected authentic remorse or simply the psychological impact of losing everything remained unclear. Regardless of his motivations, the acknowledgement provided a form of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I hope you find a way to build a better life with the lessons you've learned from this experience." With that exchange, David left the conference room and walked out of my life forever. Through the office windows, I watched him climb into a taxi, rather than the luxury vehicles he'd become accustomed to driving. The image was symbolic of his complete transformation from successful real estate developer to someone who could no longer afford basic transportation, let alone the lifestyle he'd assumed was permanently secured. In the weeks that followed David's final surrender, the practical implications of Article 13's enforcement became fully apparent. The asset liquidation process proceeded with remarkable efficiency, generating proceeds that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Austin's booming real estate market meant that our properties sold quickly and at premium prices, while the art collection and luxury items attracted competitive bidding from collectors throughout Texas and beyond. The final settlement calculation reached $91 million, reflecting both the accumulated interest provisions and the enhanced valuations that had emerged during the liquidation process. The number was staggering even by Austin's inflated standards, representing one of the largest divorce settlements in Texas history, and certainly the most devastating prenuptial enforcement ever recorded. More importantly, the precedent established by Judge Morrison's decision to uphold Article 13 fundamentally changed the legal landscape for prenuptial agreements throughout Texas. Family law attorneys began incorporating similar liquidated damages provisions into their clients' marital contracts, creating a new category of legal protection for spouses who wanted to ensure that adultery would carry meaningful financial consequences. The psychological impact of my victory was more complex than the financial and legal ramifications. While I felt profound satisfaction at having protected myself so comprehensively from David's betrayal, I also experienced an unexpected sense of emptiness once the immediate crisis had passed. The strategic planning and legal maneuvering that had consumed my energy for months were suddenly unnecessary, leaving me with vast resources but without the clear sense of purpose that had driven my survival efforts. The woman who had crafted Article 13 7 years earlier had been motivated primarily by fear, and the recognition that marriage represented a form of vulnerability that required sophisticated protection. The woman who had executed that clause with ruthless precision had been focused entirely on defeating David's attempt to abandon me with minimal assets. Now I needed to become someone different, a person who could use her hard-won independence and substantial resources to create a meaningful life, rather than simply defending against external threats. The process of rebuilding my identity and relationships proved to be more challenging than the legal warfare that had preceded it. The systematic isolation I'd experienced during my marriage meant that I had few genuine friendships to resume, and the intensity of the divorce proceedings had made it difficult to focus on anything beyond immediate survival needs. I found myself wealthy beyond imagination but socially adrift, professionally accomplished but personally uncertain about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Reconnecting with Patricia Rodriguez, my mentor and the architect of Article 13's legal framework, provided both professional guidance and personal perspective on the transition I was experiencing. Patricia had observed many clients struggle with the aftermath of major legal victories, and she understood that success in warfare didn't automatically translate into happiness in peacetime. "You've won completely," she told me during one of our lunch meetings at a downtown Austin restaurant. "David will never recover from what you've done to him, and the legal precedent you've established will protect other spouses for decades to come. But now you need to figure out what victory means beyond simply defeating your enemies." Her insight was characteristically penetrating. The skills I'd developed during my marriage and divorce, strategic planning, risk assessment, psychological manipulation, legal maneuvering, were enormously powerful, but also potentially limiting, if they became my only tools for navigating relationships and challenges. I needed to redevelop capacities for trust, vulnerability, and genuine connection that had been dormant during the years of defensive positioning. The financial resources provided by Article 13's enforcement created extraordinary opportunities for meaningful work and social impact. I established a foundation focused on providing legal assistance to women facing domestic violence and financial abuse, drawing on my own experience to help others recognize and escape controlling relationships. The foundation's work was deeply personal and professionally fulfilling, allowing me to transform my survival experience into protection for other vulnerable spouses. I also returned to practicing law, though in a different capacity than before my marriage. Rather than corporate litigation, I focused on family law and prenuptial agreement drafting, becoming widely recognized as Austin's leading expert in marital contract protection. The David Mitchell case had established my reputation and provided me with insights into relationship dynamics that made me uniquely effective at crafting protective legal frameworks for other couples. Perhaps most importantly, I began the slow process of learning to trust again, both in professional relationships and personal connections. The systematic betrayal I'd experienced during my marriage had created defensive mechanisms that were necessary for survival but potentially destructive for future happiness. Recognizing when to maintain healthy boundaries versus when to allow authentic vulnerability became an ongoing challenge that required constant attention and adjustment. 6 months after David's final surrender, I received an unexpected piece of information that provided a form of closure I hadn't realized I was seeking. Marcus Thompson, the private investigator who had documented David's affair with such devastating precision, contacted me with news about my former husband's current circumstances. David had left Austin permanently, unable to rebuild his reputation or business relationships in a city where his scandal was too well known. He'd moved to a small town outside Dallas, where he was working as a sales associate at a residential real estate agency, earning a modest commission-based income that barely covered his basic living expenses. The successful developer, who had once commanded respect and influence throughout Austin's business community, was now showing suburban houses to first-time buyers and struggling to make his monthly rent payments. The information should have felt like additional vindication, but instead it provoked an unexpected mixture of emotions. While I felt no regret about enforcing Article 13 or sympathy for David's self-inflicted circumstances, I also experienced a strange sense of melancholy about the complete destruction of someone I'd once loved. The man who had betrayed our marriage and planned to abandon me was genuinely contemptible, but he had also been my partner for 7 years, and the person with whom I'd shared hopes for a future that would never exist. Perhaps that complexity was inevitable when personal relationships intersected with legal and financial warfare. David had earned every consequence he was experiencing through his systematic deception and calculated cruelty, but human emotions were more nuanced than legal mechanisms, resistant to the precise justice that contract enforcement could provide. The final perspective on my journey came from an unexpected source, Jessica Chen, David's former mistress, who reached out to me through a mutual acquaintance nearly a year after the divorce was finalized. She wanted to meet for coffee, ostensibly to apologize for her role in destroying my marriage, but actually, I suspected, to satisfy her curiosity about the woman who had so comprehensively defeated both her and David. We met at a neutral location in downtown Austin, far from the restaurants and hotels where she and David had conducted their affair. Jessica appeared genuinely nervous and somewhat ashamed, clearly uncomfortable with the role she'd played in triggering such devastating consequences for everyone involved. Her youth and naivete were more apparent in person than they had been in Marcus's surveillance photographs, making her seem more like a college student than the sophisticated homewrecker I'd imagined. "I want you to know that I had no idea about the prenuptial agreement," she said, her voice barely audible in the coffee shop's ambient noise. "David told me that your divorce would be straightforward, and that he'd be able to provide for both of us comfortably. I never would have gotten involved if I'd known what would happen to him." The statement was probably true, but also irrelevant. Jessica's ignorance of the legal consequences didn't excuse her decision to pursue a relationship with a married man, and her shock at David's financial destruction didn't mitigate the harm she'd caused to our marriage. But her obvious distress and genuine remorse suggested that she'd learned important lessons from the experience, even if those lessons had come at an enormous cost to everyone involved. "What you and David did to me was wrong," I replied simply. "But the consequences you're both experiencing are the result of choices you made freely, with full knowledge that your actions would hurt other people. I don't take pleasure in anyone's suffering, but I also don't accept responsibility for protecting people from the natural results of their own behavior." The conversation provided a form of resolution that was both satisfying and sobering. Jessica's apology acknowledged the reality of the harm that had been done, while also demonstrating that meaningful consequences could sometimes inspire genuine recognition of moral failures. Her obvious regret and changed circumstances suggested that the painful lessons learned through David's destruction might prevent similar mistakes in the future. As I drove home from that final meeting, through the Austin streets where David and I had built our life together, and where his betrayal had ultimately destroyed him, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from naive newlywed to legal strategist, to independent woman with resources and wisdom beyond anything I'd imagined possible. The prenuptial agreement I'd crafted 7 years earlier had been the product of fear and strategic thinking, designed to protect me from hypothetical betrayal that I'd hoped would never materialize. Article 13's enforcement had been the culmination of that preparation, a legal masterpiece that had converted David's infidelity into his complete financial destruction. But the most important transformation had been personal rather than professional. The recognition that true security came not from defensive legal mechanisms, but from authentic self-knowledge and the wisdom to build relationships based on mutual respect, rather than control. David's affair had triggered the most comprehensive asset forfeiture in Texas legal history, but it had also revealed character flaws that made our marriage unsustainable regardless of his fidelity. The systematic control and emotional manipulation that had characterized our relationship for years would have eventually destroyed our partnership even without Jessica's involvement. Article 13 had simply provided a clean and definitive ending to a relationship that was already dead in everything but legal status. Standing in my downtown penthouse that evening, looking out over the Austin skyline where David had once planned to build his legacy, I felt a profound sense of completion and anticipation. The defensive phase of my life was over, replaced by the opportunity to use my hard-won resources and knowledge to create something meaningful and lasting. The woman who had survived David's betrayal and destroyed his ability to harm others was now free to become whoever she chose to be, limited only by her own imagination and values rather than external threats or constraints. Article 13 had been my protection and my weapon, but it had also been my education in the importance of preparation, the power of strategic thinking, and the absolute necessity of maintaining independence, even within the most intimate relationships. The lessons learned through crafting and enforcing that devastating clause would guide me for the rest of my life, ensuring that I would never again be vulnerable to the kind of systematic exploitation that David had attempted. The future stretched ahead with infinite possibility, unmarked by the limitations that others might try to impose, and unlimited by the resources that my own strategic planning had secured. David's betrayal had been the catalyst for my transformation from dependent wife to independent woman, and his destruction had been the proof that intelligence, preparation, and moral clarity could triumph over deception, manipulation, and casual cruelty. The final victory wasn't measured in dollars transferred or assets seized. but in the recognition that I had not only survived David's attempt to diminish and abandon me, but had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable than I'd ever been before. Article 13 had been the instrument of justice, but justice itself was simply the foundation for building a life worthy of the woman I'd discovered myself capable of becoming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.